Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with host Jacob Berman. Today, Dr. Robert M. Price joins us once again. And this time, we're going to be doing something a bit different. We're going to watch the film Caesar's Messiah together. Now, Dr. Price has actually never seen the documentary before. He's read the book, but he's never seen the documentary before. So this is the first time he's watched this. And we're going to watch it together. I'm going to rewatch it, but he's going to watch it for the first time. And we'll take it from there.
1 hour later.
Okay. We finished that.
Fascinating, beautifully done.
Yeah, I thought so myself.
I used to think that the whole Flavian origins hypothesis was extremely contrived, but the more I read and think about it, the warmer I get to it. It still seems to me a kind of a bold hypothesis, but not an implausible one. I don't know that it's possible to verify it, but Joe and the others are making a strong case that they argue in a powerful way. If sociologically or statistically, mythicists of any kind are a marginalized fringe group. I mean, just numerically, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. And it's also easy to see how institutional factors are involved in the inability or unwillingness of mainstream scholars to think, to fairly evaluate this. Now, I want to be real careful. I'm not a mind reader, and I don't know any individual's motives or what limits their thinking. I don't assume I am smarter than anybody that disagrees with me. There are various ways of looking at it, but it does seem to me that this is just kind of what Thomas Kuhn said in his book, The Structure of Scientific Religion. Revolutions, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He says that, there is new data discovered from time to time, but basically one understanding is supplanted by another when someone decides to zero in on what he calls the anomalous data, the facts that remain odd and outlying and don't seem to fit into the standard story. And so if you start there and say, what would these data imply? And you're kind of going back to the drawing board, and you hope to come up with a new paradigm, a new heuristic model for understanding that will be more comprehensive and explain the old and the new features of it. And but it takes a long while for even a well-argued case to become mainstream, because too many of the current establishment scholars have too much invested in playing the game as it stands. And it's not necessarily that they're saying, oh my God, you mean I've been doing this in vain and I got to start all over again? It's too late for that. I think a lot of people do feel that way, but I would rather say that is why some of them have trouble thinking outside the box they're in. They're not wittingly saying, I'm not going to give this guy any credence, or I would lose mine. Some of them might, who knows, but there's no reason to think that, especially since the stranger, the more revolutionary a new paradigm appears, well, the better a case you got to make. I mean, it's good that your theory has to run the gauntlet. Otherwise, because scientific method always seeks to debunk one's own new theory to see if it can handle the rigors of scrutiny. Because if it can't, well, what the hell with it? You don't want to believe it yourself then. But if it can, and these guys are making a really good case, I think it has to be considered, or it ought to be considered a respectable, powerful very likely option to explain Christian origins. Doesn't explain everything either, but it because I think like the diversity of early Christianity implies various other things were going on, but because what is it that these guys were persecuting and silencing? I mean, there must have been rival Christianities that didn't reflect their agenda and therefore probably did not arise because of it. But that doesn't weaken the case. It fits in with it.
What did you think about the numerous parallels that he brings up in both his book and in the film between Titus's military campaign and Jesus' ministry?
His work side by side, I noticed an amazing connection between them. Certain events from the ministry of Jesus seem to closely parallel episodes from the military campaign of Roman Caesar Titus Flavius, a campaign which took place 40 years after Jesus supposedly lived. Both Jesus and Titus began their campaigns at the Sea of Galilee and then go into the Galilean countryside, followed by a journey to Jerusalem. Once they reach the city's outskirts, they pause for a period before they enter. Finally, they leave the city where their campaigns come to an end. To catalog the many parallels, I gave each one a convenient name that related to the concept in that particular parallel set. Starting at Galilee, each of these are episodes that occurred both in the gospel story of Jesus and in the history of Titus's military campaign. Both Jesus and Titus journeyed to Jerusalem, each sending messengers ahead to meet him when he gets to the city. When the Romans get to Jerusalem, they notice that the Jewish factions are fighting against themselves. At this point in the Gospels, Jesus talks about a house divided against itself cannot stand. Then Josephus wrote that in preparation for battle, Titus ordered all of the fruit trees between the Roman camp and the walls of Jerusalem cut down. At this point in the Gospels, Jesus states that if a fruit tree does not bear good fruit, cut it down. Titus goes around the walls of Jerusalem looking for the best place to construct a tower from which they can launch their attack. At this point in the Gospels, Jesus asks, which one of you who is going to build a tower doesn't first sit down and think about the cost? At this point in the history, Titus sends Josephus to ask the Jews what terms they will accept for peace. In the Gospels, Jesus describes a king who sends a delegation to ask for terms of peace. Both Jesus and Titus at this point have triumphant entrances into Jerusalem, during which, amazingly, stones are said to cry out. Each then drives a den of thieves out from the area in front of the temple. This is followed by Titus encircling Jerusalem with a wall and Jesus predicting that Jerusalem will be encircled with a wall.
Well, some of them strike me as kind of outrageous, like the Fishers of Men thing, where they're like playing whack-a-mole with the Jewish soldiers.
Jesus comes to the Sea of Galilee at the beginning of his ministry. He gathers his disciples to him and he says, "Do not be afraid. Follow me and become fishers of men." In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus actually says catchers of men. Titus comes to the same location, to the Sea of Galilee. He gathers his troops, his disciples, together and he says, "Don't be afraid." And then he leads them. They follow him and they attack a group of Jewish rebels. They sink the Jews' boats. The Jews attempt to swim to safety, and the Romans use their spears to catch them. They become fishers of men.
What's being suggested here is that this story that you find in the Gospels is in some ways sort of like a grim parable about that military event. It's sort of like a bit tongue-in-cheek, I think. The Romans had a vicious sense of humor like this.
There's something to see. Or the woman cooking up her baby as like a Passover lamb, and this is my body.
Because of the wall, starvation sets in Jerusalem. Josephus wrote that a woman named Mary, who called her son a myth for the world, slayed him, ate him, thereby turning him into a human Passover lamb. In the Gospels, we now have the Last Supper. Jesus tells his disciples, "Take, eat, this is my body, this is my blood," thereby turning him into a human Passover lamb.
But there is a point. It is kind of striking, and it's just when you have to resort to saying, well, they're kidding, that this is really kind of a black humor joke, that always makes me, I call that the irony dodge. Like when they say, well, Jesus didn't really mean to say, give up all your money. He was really kidding. That bothers me a little bit. But on the other hand, Joe has this, he wrote an article for the Journal of Higher Criticism where he set this out. And he says it's not just the correspondences, but in the same order. I mean, we're used to seeing that, comparing the Old and the New Testaments, like the Moses thing he mentioned, or you could do the same with Moses and the Jacob stories. It looks like the Moses stories are rewritten from the Jacob stories. So what he says is not far out methodologically. And so a couple of the things, I don't know, but that's really bowled over by the major thing about the prediction of the destruction of the temple by a son of man.
Jesus makes very specific prophecies as to what will happen when the Son of Man makes his visitation. He refers to three key events. The Galilean towns will be crushed, Jerusalem will be encircled with a wall, and the temple will be razed, leaving not one stone atop another.
40 years in the future. And he doesn't say, I am coming back to do this, right? It's in the third person. So that makes an awful lot of sense to me, especially since we know that Josephus and Yohanan ben Zakkai both said they thought the predicted Messiah was Vespasian. I mean, that's a Jewish opinion. You can't simply assume that these guys were just saying anything to get out of a tight spot. They might have been, but who knows? So I have to take this very seriously, and I'm really leaning more and more toward the idea that it's really talking about Titus destroying Jerusalem. Nobody else did, just him.
Does that also mean that you're gravitating towards Atwill and Valiant's identification of Titus as the Son of Man?
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense to me, and like a lot of other things. A lot of things in the Olivet discourse are vague but identifiable. Wars and rumors of wars, famines and pestilences. Well, of course, there are things like that happening in the world anytime in history, but you can't, like Hermann Dettering showed that in Matthew's version, you can kind of identify particular instances of this in the area that might be referred to, and veiled a little bit, but you say, well, yeah, there was a pestilence here at this time, and so on and so forth. So to say that the conqueror or the destroyer of Jerusalem is the Son of Man, well, that is most of the time in the Gospels, that phrase is used as a kind of euphemistic cloak for someone, and not a theological title. Even the coming of the Son of Man's sayings in the Gospels, as Morris Casey showed, seem to be kind of shorthand references to Daniel 7. which itself is very symbolic. So it's not like Jesus saying, well, the Messiah is going to come and do this and that. That's a title, but this is more of a circumlocution, as they say. And it could refer to Titus, since he did what is being described as if it were a prophecy, really a prediction after the fact, as they call it. So I am warming to that. And with the Flavians, that argument about the Christian Flavians, I mean, that you can't ignore that. That Constantine was a Flavian and so forth. It's the business about Constantine converting from paganism to Christianity with that vision.
In the 4th century, Flavius Constantine made Christianity the state religion of Rome.
That is, there are 2 accounts where he sees the sign of the Chi-Rho and becomes a Christian, but there are also 2 that say no, what he saw there, it said conquered by this, was simply the origin, the revealed origin of a battle standard they were going to use, and that Constantine had been born and raised a Christian. Well, that what these guys are saying really does fit with that. And what Jim Valiant and Warren Fahey have come up with, and was touched on here, these major early Christian symbols being the symbols of the Flavians, that it's a little tough to poo-poo that and say, it doesn't mean anything. It's got to mean something, and it's pretty obvious what.
There was a Christian theologian whose name was Titus Flavius Clemens, Clement of Alexandria. And he's the one who actually described the first Christian symbols. And he said they were the anchor, the boat, the fish, the olive branch, the star. And oddly, these are the very symbols that the Flavian Caesars used on their coins.
So I think they did a real good job.
Yeah, I thought so too. What I also found interesting in the film is their argument that the Flavians were very concerned about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community, during the Jewish War, and then Joseph Atwill talked about that they confiscated the Jewish literature, and they were trying to destroy everything.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, the only Jewish literature ever discovered from the 1st century AD as the Jewish messianic prophecies.
The thing that most moved the Jews' revolt against Rome was an obscure prophecy from among their writings that a world ruler would come out of Palestine.
Once they captured the Jewish scripture, they had all other copies of it destroyed.
And that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls had to have been buried in a cave, because that was the only way they could be safe from the Roman destruction.
And that their plan was thwarted because some of them had stored up copies in caves that they didn't destroy. And it kind of gets into the whole deal with the teacher of righteousness and the coming Messiah. And in the scrolls, they talk about that the teacher will rise from the dead in 40 years. And that kind of made me think to ask you, could that 40 years, like the teacher rising in 40 years, have been like typologically layered over Titus and Jesus in that 40-year gap between the 2 figures? Could that connect in that sense as a reusable? Because the teacher, what I mean by that is the teacher will rise in 40 years. It reminds me of the second coming. He's going to come back when a temple, when something bad happens at the temple, and it happens in 40 years.
Well, that they certainly wouldn't have been having Titus in mind,
right? I'm not talking about the viewpoints of the Dead Sea Scroll authors now. I'm saying the gospel authors. Uh, yeah. The reason why I asked,
Yeah, interesting. That could well be.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say.
Huh. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, that's well worth considering. Wow.
Yeah, because the teacher does have some amazing parallels with Jesus. He's opposed by the high priest, just like Jesus is opposed by a high priest. The teacher is opposed by a liar and an axe. Paul has a vision of Jesus. He says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Paul, of course, in the epistles is kind of a liar. I could easily see, to an extent, typological parallels between the teacher and Jesus on that extent. That's kind of what I mean by that.
Yeah, maybe Allegro was right in some sense that the second coming of the teacher of righteousness was the prototype for belief about Jesus, and it wouldn't be surprising. But then again, there are striking parallels in the teaching and the history of analogous movements.
Right.
The same kind of thing is likely to happen again and again, including the claim that the martyred leader isn't really dead. He's in hiding and will come back, like the hidden imam in Islam. Or one of the sons of Constantine, Constans, I think, they believed he had disappeared and would return one day as the emperor of the last days. There's still Catholics that believe that. Some believe Napoleon would return. King Arthur would return when England needed him most, and so on and so on. So it's the kind of thing a lot of people say in similar circumstances.
Right.
Boy. There's also, a couple of other people make arguments that would dovetail with this. Danila Oder, O-D-E-R, I guess I'm pronouncing it right. She did a book that I reviewed, and she summarized her argument in a chapter of the book John Loftus and I compiled, The Varieties of Jesus, Mythicism, where she thinks that that one of the Flavian aristocratic women was really supposed to be the woman that anointed Jesus, and that Mark is based on a play written for her birthday as a salute to her. And that's a different, interesting angle on a Flavian origin of at least one of the Gospels. And then I just read a book, Origin of Early Christian Literature, I think by a woman named Robin Walsh, which examines the Gospels.
I have that book too.
She says that, look, you can see how these things were written, just as Joe said, according to the conventions, and likely in the context of a kind of elite circle of literati, that it's about a religious hero, but that doesn't even. But there were Hercules dramas and so on as well, and that would kind of fit the notion of what Joe is envisioning with. It struck me reading Caesar's Messiah that he's thinking of kind of a panel, like a bunch of writers on Saturday Night Live, engaged in a common enterprise. And that struck me as kind of arbitrary to the point of possibly being silly, but she makes that understandable in a natural way also, Robin Walsh. And so there are various, and as far as I know, she's not trying to promote the Atwill, Valiant, etc. hypothesis, but it certainly dovetails with it and makes the whole thing more believable.
Right. It seems like scholars are slowly coming around that the Gospels are written by far more sophisticated people than they previously anticipated.
Even Vernon K. Robbins and Burton Mack, for a couple of decades now, have been writing about how the kind of episodes we have in the Synoptic Gospels, the pericope, but specifically the pronouncement stories, where we have a quick sketch of the situation and a punchline that it leads to. Hey, what is your master doing eating with those publicans and sinners? And Jesus says, well, who needs the doctor, the sick or the healthy? Well, these guys, Robbins and Mack, did a huge amount of research showing that, you know what the closest analogies for this are? They are school exercises where the students were, let's say they're studying Socrates, and they would be assigned write up some of these as what we call pronouncement stories or apophthegms. And what would Socrates or Diogenes say? Make one up, and because then I'll know if you really understand the kind of guys they were. Well, once that became known, you really had to take a second look at this idea of the oral tradition and rabbinic parallels. Wait a second. Maybe we've just been barking up the wrong tree, both in terms of it being oral tradition rather than a sit-down literary composition, and an exclusively Hebraic, Jewish, almost rabbinic setting, like David Dalby and others have said, and look at the Hellenistic background, because as Martin Hengel showed decades ago, it's almost useless to say, well, this is a Hellenistic element in the Gospels or whatever, and this is a Jewish one. He says, look, forget it. Since Alexander, Judaism of every type was Hellenized. Where do you think they got the idea of a rabbi with his disciples? That's like the Peripatetics, the Stoics, the Platonic Academy, and all that. Where do you think they got the idea of allegorizing? Well, that comes from Stoicism, and so on and so on. Geez, you know, what have you got left? It's a whole different ball game after Alexander the Great.
What do you think about the part where they talk about Josephus being Joseph of Arimathea?
In Josephus's biography, he describes when he was in the entourage of Titus during the closing stages of the siege of Jerusalem, he chanced upon 3 of his friends who were being crucified, and he pleaded with Titus for their release, and Titus gave that permission, and the 3 figures were removed from the cross. 2 of them died, and 1 revived.
In the Gospels, Joseph of Arimathea asked the Roman commander to take Jesus down from the cross. In Josephus's history, Joseph Bar Matthias asked the Roman commander to take someone down from the cross. Arimathea is a pun on Josephus's last name, Bar Matthias.
I find that very tempting because nobody's really sure where Arimathea would have been if it was a real place. Richard Carrier plausibly takes it as a pun. Ari, the best, Mathetes, disciples, and the suffix meaning the place of the best disciple, kind of making Joseph of Arimathea into the beloved disciple. I take that seriously too, but I have to admit, once you get to the 3 crucified guys and one of them taken down alive, that really makes the Bar Matthias Arimathea thing very tempting.
Right.
So I find that pretty likely.
Because not only does a story resemble Joseph of Arimathea, but he has a similar name, much closer than the to me at least than the symbol than the example Dr. Carrier provided.
I mean, that's viable, but this seems to beat that in my opinion. It's an even better theory rather than a bad one.
That's what I think.
Yeah. And of course, the idea that New Testament writers knew and used Josephus.
Oh, yeah.
I've been a convert to that ever since I read Steve Mason's books, and how like the way Luke seems to be derivative from Josephus on the Egyptian and Theudas and all of that stuff. And especially the thing with Jesus ben Ananias. Ted Whedon's book, The Two Jesuses, is darn convincing that the Gospels all knew that and adapted it. And he shows like over 20 points of connection between Josephus's narrative and the passion narratives of the Gospels. It's pretty astounding. And again, you know, if the disciples of Jesus had been like today's anti-parallelists, if that's a word, where they say, well, one will be taken away and so on. Where, Lord? He says, well, where the vultures are circling, that's where you'll find the body. In other words, where there's smoke, there's fire. Where else does it come from? And when faced with this kind of stuff, the Orthodox apologists say, yeah, there's smoke, but there's no fire. And you got to explain this some way. And they really don't have one except the obvious one.
I think even Hugh Schoenfield insinuated that the Gospel of Mark used Josephus because he noted parallels between Joseph of Arimathea and Josephus Flavius as well.
I think also he said that the Emmaus Road story was kind of like a story in Josephus, though I forget what the original context was. But yeah, I mean, it's an old idea, but it's just been ridiculed for so long by apologists, and it's only coming into its own again now. I really enjoyed seeing Acharya on there, and she and I became great friends a while before her. Well, obviously before her death, but she was really terrific, and her books are just stuffed with information I never would have heard of otherwise. And it was great seeing Rod Blackhurst and hearing him talk about this topic. I really know him from the Gospel of Barnabas stuff. And there's a couple of books in there that I've never even seen, like Goodbye Jesus and Jesus Never Existed. I'm going to have to order them. I hope I get the time to read them someday. Oh boy, yeah.
I think that once scholars finally admitted that Luke Acts used Josephus, they opened the can of worms there.
Yep.
Because like, okay, if Luke Acts used Josephus, then what's stopping the rest of the New Testament?
Yep. Yeah, the reason they hate this is the dating. They don't want to make the Gospels that late because, of course, it is,
Same with Paul.
But that's all, I think.
Okay. Yeah, because to me, as I discussed with you before several times, the dating of Paul, like in my earlier days of research, and I looked at the dating and when I found out that scholars believe that Paul's texts were pre-war, I was a little bewildered by that, because there were some things in there that didn't make any sense to me as pre-war, but I wasn't sure yet until I took a deeper look into it, and I concluded that I think that you're right, Dr. Price, and I think the Dutch radicals are right that the text is post-war, because Paul portrays the temple as being metaphysical. And when I realized that, I'm like, okay, how could he say that the temple is now within us and Jesus is also a temple in heaven? It's no longer a building. Paul frequently says that the temple is not a building anymore. It's metaphysical. I'm like, well, that it almost sounds like to me saying we don't need a third temple because it's in us all. And that sounds like an argument somebody would be making after the war.
Yep. There's a great book you ought to read if you've not read it. J.C. O'Neill's The Theology of Acts in its Historical Setting. He, a very conservative scholar in many ways, but in terms of textual criticism, he identified what he thinks are interpolations in Romans, Galatians, and First John, and I find him pretty convincing. But on this, it wasn't about interpolations. I'm just saying that he's not some wild-eyed crazy man. This shouldn't sound eccentric. He said that there are a number of things in Acts that seem to imply that, including the temple stuff. Why would anybody talk, like you say, about a metaphorical, metaphysical temple unless you're trying to explain why it doesn't debunk and destroy everything, that the earthly temple was ruined? Hey, don't worry, we got something just as good or better. Or like in Romans 12, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, etc., which is your spiritual service. What does that mean? I mean, that implies liturgy, not just you owe it to God, but now there is a spiritual sacrifice. You wouldn't say stuff like, I guess you could say, well, if you were forced out of the temple, and like what the happened to the Qumran people while the temple still stood, they would have their own version of it. That's a possibility, but it sounds to me like the letter to the Hebrews. The whole point of it seems to be saying, well, we got no earthly temple anymore, but luckily we still have the one that counts up there in the heavenly penthouse.
Right. But so he says, if I'm understanding you correctly, his argument is that any evidence that Paul wrote after the war and his epistles are actually interpolations.
Yeah, he thinks that, but usually he has another reason for thinking so, that there's unusual vocabulary or whatever. But he thinks, yeah, that and like the thing in Thessalonians, well, God's wrath has come upon them at last. What the heck could that refer to? It has to be the destruction of the temple. Well, what else is it?
Right.
And there are other things like that.
There was a similar argument like that coming from Christopher Lawson. Him and I had an interaction about that. Like, he was telling me that he found my argument to be interesting, but very intriguing. But he then said, I only found evidence of interpolations, because he goes with a pre-war dating for Paul, following the mindset of S.G.F. Brandon, his view on Paul. But when I decided to do a little experiment, I'm going to take out these so-called interpolations and see what happens. Paul didn't make any sense, gibberish. The letter, at least it didn't to me. They were disjointed. The missing passages in the so-called interpolations, when you remove them, it breaks the context of Paul.
Yes.
Which tells me this is not just an interpolation issue. This is really because Paul wrote it. I mean, or the original authors wrote it. And this is post-war. This was originally there, is what I'm saying.
Oh.
Yeah.
Another great book on this is William O. Walker Jr.'s, I think it's oh boy. Wait a second. I think I have that with.
Well, while you're looking for that, another point I'll quickly make is,
I think it's interpolations in the Pauline Epistles. Go ahead.
In the Epistle to the Galatians, the Paul character is saying, "Oh, look, I had this argument. I went 14 years ago. I was over here, and then, actually, no. I'm not putting the chronology right. He says, I returned I was in Jerusalem with Barnabas for 15 days after a period of 3 years, and then 14 years later, I returned there with Titus." And it sounds like he's saying that the argument he had with James and Cephas happened a long time ago. This is not happening right now. And Galatians went way after the fact, almost 20 years after the fact, if not more. I'm like, if you look at that huge distance between what Paul is saying happened in his earlier phases of his life, it's happening way later. That started to make me think that even the way it's written is insinuating it's written way afterwards. And to me, I think the argument that Paul is making makes better sense post-war if James and Cephas are dead. and they can't speak out against it. Like, because the other thing is Paul takes advantage of leaving their positions a bit vague in his own in the epistle to the Galatians to center all of the attention on his own argument. He gives himself the center of attention.
As for them, it's like C.S. Lewis said, they're dead and can't blow the gaff.
That's And go ahead.
Origen refuting Celsus. Of course, what's he going to do? I mean, the guy's long dead, and he figures his arguments need to be addressed, but still, they can't get a response now.
I love that you brought up Origen, because I was just about to bring him up, because he says that the Clement in the Epistle to the Philippians is the same Clement that was the Pope. And Joseph Atwill and Valiant and Fay argue convincingly to me that Titus Flavius Clemens was the historical Pope Clement of Rome. And they even have the same anchor association. Eusebius saying, oh, he was drowned in the ocean when they tied him to an anchor. And it's like it's Titus Flavius Clemens has that symbol, of course. So I'm like, okay, well, I think you're the same guy. So let's think about that for a second. According to Roman historians, I don't remember where right now, he was but a child in the late 60s CE. If we pretend that Philippians was written in the 50s, he was nothing more than molecules. He was so it's like he's not going to be going around preaching out of his mother's womb in the gospel of Paul. I think, and I don't think he'd be doing that even as a child. I think when Clement when he became a huge part of Christianity in the 90s, Philippians would, at the earliest, not even latest, at the earliest, be dated then, to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think Philippians betrays itself as a pseudepigraph, or at least two or three of them put together, when Paul is talking about his upcoming trial, and he says, I'd like to get killed and go to be with Christ forever, but I'm pretty sure I'll be spared for your sake, so I can continue to help you. Well, this is a wink to the reader that, he did get killed, but someone is carrying on his ministry by writing letters like this. And all of the stuff about how, I haven't attained perfection yet, but I'm aiming at that, and the resurrection. He knows that they know Paul is dead, and this is the eve of the whole thing. So who knows when the heck it was written?
Yeah, that's the reason why I carefully said at the earliest 90s, because I was actually thinking about the argument you just made in your book, The Amazing Colossal Apostle. And you were talking about Walter Schmitz. He's all good with saying Philippians is very different pieces that were jungled together, but they were all written by Paul conveniently.
Yeah, that's amazing to me. And with First Corinthians and Second Corinthians, it's like you had a bunch of fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you're trying to glue them together. Schmittholz is great, but Hermann Dettering was a student of his, and he brought up some of these theories like mythicism, and Schmittholz would have no patience with that stuff. Yet he was great in his, with the dating business. If he is right about what First Corinthians is referring to, it's all about Gnosticism as attested in the 2nd century. But his inference is that, it didn't start that late. It was already around. And that's plausible too. But he was so stuck on Orthodox tradition in some ways, and so wild in others.
My position on Paul is a bit similar to yours to an extent. Like I currently think Paul, who knows if I'll change my mind. I think Paul wrote quite a bit of what is supposedly attributed to him in the authentic letters. But your argument is convincing me that whole chapters appear to have been inserted into his text. The evidence of that some of the letters are broken up into multiple parts is probably because most of those parts are written later. And I think Marcion's influence on Paul's epistles needs to be taken more seriously.
Yeah,
there's some kind of hairy business going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I got about 3 interesting looking books on Marcion and the epistles, Marcion and the Gospels that I just cannot wait to read. They're not right on top of the list, but I have a hunch that's really going to make an impact.
I recently spoke to Dr. Litwa, and I asked him if he'd be willing to do a show with you. He actually said yes. So I need to figure out. I would like to have our next show with you and him.
What's the name again?
Dr. Litwa.
Oh, yeah. You're not kidding.
I'm not kidding at all. And he said something very fascinating in the last interview I did with him. He actually said that one of the authentic letters of Paul, and the way it's translated, forgot which one he was talking about. I think he's talking about Philippians, but it's recorded, so that's the good news. He said that, there appears to be bishops in here. Knowledge of later Christians, like the pseudos. He's not absolutely sure about it, but I find it interesting that he said that. Because does that mean I didn't ask him this during the interview, but it made me think, does that mean you think it's possible? It's much later.
Yeah, to me, that's a dead giveaway. I think Philippians is in effect a 4th pastoral epistle. Not by the same guy, but the same idea. Because that's a dead giveaway. In my opinion,
I want to put you and him together to talk about Paul and Gnosticism. I think.
Oh, he is great.
Yeah, I got to make it happen. I'm going to make it happen.
Oh, thanks. Terrific.
Yeah.
That is great. He recently accepted a Facebook friends request from me. So
awesome.
We'll be good to.
Yeah.
He is amazing. I just pre-ordered his book, Found Christianities. That's going to be great. I'm sure.
That's amazing. Well, thanks for joining me again, Dr. Price. This has been a fun discussion.
Oh, yeah.
I'm really glad I got you to see the film.
Yeah. I never would have seen it, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, I am, of course, honored that you watched it with me for the first time.
Oh, great pleasure.
I got it all on record. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.